I want to talk about an adaptive strategy process, which is a concept from the book Your Strategy Needs a Strategy by the Boston Consulting Group. And an adaptive strategy comes in handy and is appropriate for businesses that are in an unpredictable environment and you can't really change your environment. So the classical approach, which is go big, drive value, drive down costs, be one of the top three, is appropriate for an industry in which there's little change and you can't really change things. So scale is really important. In adaptive environments, things can change quickly, and you need to, as a company, develop a bottom-up strategy for identifying the need to change and making incremental little experiments to see what works. But what's important with an adaptive strategy in doing those experiments is to rely on actual data rather than just gut feel. I mean, obviously gut feel is how you develop hypotheses to figure out which experiments to do in the first place, but you need some sort of data set to figure out what's working. And an example they used is a clothing brand called Zara, which in the clothing business, normally what you're doing is you're coming up with a couple seasons worth of clothing per year. So maybe that's your fall, your spring, and maybe your summer season. And what you try and do is you try and, anticipate consumer demand, make your clothes, ship them in, hope they sell. But the problem with that is, what about the stuff that doesn't sell? Anytime you walk into a clothing store, you'll see, clearance racks where stuff's marked down 50%. Well, that's obviously not their high-flying items. That's kind of the crap left over that no one wanted to buy. And apparently in the retail industry, retail clothing, that's up to 50% of the clothing ends up on the sales rack. So Zara wanted to figure out a way to avoid having that happen. And what they did was they moved their supply chain closer to the US, from China to Mexico, and in Europe over to Turkey, I believe. And that allowed them, while the manufacturing is more expensive there, that allowed them to get it done quicker and to market much faster. So they'd sit there in the season and be able to identify trends and move towards those. So, they'd start the season with things they pretty much knew they were going to work, but they weren't taking as many risks on items that may work because someone saw it in Vogue magazine, and stuff like that. They're able to identify trends kind of midstream and get them to market much quicker. And as a result, the amount of items that they had to throw on clearance went way down. And also they had a lot more, inventory turns, which is, essentially how many times your inventory turns over each year. Well, the more your inventory turns over, obviously you're making the item, you're selling it, you're reinvesting those profits, making the item again, selling it. And the more you can do that, the more profitable you're going to be per year because your fixed costs are going to remain the same. And I think that's a really interesting way of, working in an environment that is traditionally very unpredictable, because who knows what fashion styles are going to be next year. Now, there are some fashion brands that would move towards what Boston Consulting Group would consider a stable environment. So that's when it's unpredictable, yes, but you can also shape it. And the more branding power you have, the more you can shape your environment, because that's basically what branding is, right? It's changing your environment to make people buy your stuff. Now, a brand like Zara can't really do that. A brand like, and this is probably wrong, and I'm showing my age, but the Gap, which has a gigantic marketing budget, or Nike, well, they can push trends forward. When Nike does the new Chris Paul shoe, or the new, man, I'm showing my age because my kids buy it, and it's, he was on the Nets, Kyrie Irving. That when they do his shoe, well, they're going to Kyrie Irving and saying, we're paying you X to market this shoe, and and you're going to wear it this year, and we're going to sell it to kids with your name on it. Well, that's shaping your environment. Zara can't do that. They have much less of an ability to change their environment. Their environment is less malleable. So they have to rely on identifying trends, yes, doing little experiments, yes, to see what sells, and then quickly getting that into mass production and into their stores. So it's a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach Nike would use, where they market first and then sell the shoes. Zara has to see what's working with their clothing and then have their supply chain streamlined in order to get those products out to market as fast as possible. A lot of tech businesses are going to be really the same. The book mentions Google allowing some of their workers up to 20% free time to develop new products. And as you'll recall, over the years, Google has done a lot of different products that never panned out, like Google Glass, the eyewear. I remember you'll see stuff that comes on the Google site and then it comes off, and they develop and jettison new products all the time. So do companies they own, like YouTube. Well, it's interesting because you'll read, articles about some pundits saying, oh, this was a massive failure, blah, 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 blah. But you're ignoring the fact that what Google is doing is using an adaptive strategy to a quickly changing environment, and they're trying to introduce new things, a bottom-up approach from some of their mid-level executives, trying new things, and then they're figuring out what works through data and jettisoning those things that don't work. 3M would be another classic example of that. They always had a program where they allowed their engineers a lot of autonomy to develop new products, and that's famously how Post-it notes were developed. And that's a changing environment where you have to constantly develop new products for your customers, and you have to have a strategic approach within your firm to go ahead and identify those opportunities and push them down. So that's an adaptable strategy and when to use it. Again, it's when you're in a constantly changing environment. It's very unpredictable, but you can't really affect change on your circumstances. Your environment is not malleable.